developing countries. But there is one problem that I cannot solve, because when people look at the UN, many people do not see the humanitarian work that we do, sometimes in extremely difficult circumstances. 400 of our staff was killed in Gaza. People do not see our effort in pushing for the reform of the international financial architecture. People do not see our efforts in pushing for climate action and climate justice, or our efforts in relation to gender equality. People see the Security Council. That's what appears in the headlines. And obviously, the Security Council is something created long ago and represents a world that no longer exists. There are no permanent representatives from Africa or from Latin America, and there are 3 European permanent representatives: the UK, France, and Russia. People might argue, but Russia is essentially a European country. It has also an Asian part, but its center is in Europe. I mean, this is totally at odds with the reality of today's world. And so, one thing I can guarantee is that in the action of the Secretariat of the UN, we will be doing everything to correct inequalities and injustices and to guarantee effective representation to developing countries. But we have not the power to reform the Security Council or to reform the IMF or the World Bank. All this depends on the will of member states. And usually those that have power are quite reluctant in accepting a redistribution of that power.
Thank you very much. My name is Israel Ifuribo, New Central Television in Nigeria. My question is simple. How do you think the world leaders who are gathered here this weekend, how do you think they should address the issue of debt relief for developing countries, especially in Africa? Because that's one of the big issues that African countries are facing today. Thank you, sir.
We have created an expert group on debt relief. They presented their recommendations. I just mentioned it in my intervention. I know that President Ramaphosa also has created a group on debt relief. And by the way, the chair of that group, Trevor Manuel, was also a member of our group. And what is interesting is the conclusions are very similar. It is clear that we have, first of all, to look into countries in distress and have an effective debt relief for those countries. And on the other hand, we must act in different ways through the markets, dealing with credit rating agencies and taking initiatives in this regard, and through the intervention of the multilateral development banks. We need to reduce the cost of capital. And we need to make sure that there is equity in the criteria when countries borrow. There are European countries with a debt that is much higher than the debt of many African countries, but they still get access to the market with very low interest rates. And there are African countries that have solid finance and good development perspectives that still only have access to credit at very high rates. So we need to organize things in order to create the conditions, and there are ways to do it through guarantees, through the involvement of multilateral development banks, with private finance being them those that accept the first risk. There is a number of concrete measures that can be made in order to reduce the cost of capital, which would allow for lower indebtedness of countries. And at the same time, as I said, the mechanism that was put in place for debt relief has been acting too slow and it needs a very meaningful reform for countries that indeed need a reduction of their debt to have a relatively rapid mechanism to be able to achieve that result. Okay?
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General from Democratic Republic of Congo. My first question is about climate issue. So do you think that COP30 in Belém was a success, or still a success, or a failure, without some G20 members? I'm talking about climate in Brazil, in Belém. Do you find that it's a success, or it's a failure, without some G20 members? And how can you convince some of these countries absent in Belém to the resolution of doubling the adaptation finance, as you said in your address before? The last question is, how can you address the peace process issue to G20 leaders in Democratic Republic of Congo, knowing clearly that the humanitarian situation is going worse? Thank you.
It's very clear that everywhere in the world, because temperatures are rising and they will rise above 1.5 at least for some period, so-called overshooting is inevitable, that adaptation became a major priority. And one of the things I tried to fight in my presence in the COP was to achieve a guarantee that the adaptation funding will triple until 2030. And so this is one of the very important things that is being discussed in the COP. But it is also clear that it doesn't make sense to spend more and more money to correct the impacts of disasters and not to do everything possible to avoid the disasters. And to avoid the disasters means a drastic cut in the emissions. And so, with the same insistence in which I asked for tripling the funding for adaptation, I asked for a clear indication of how we are going to move the transition away from fossil fuels into renewables, and at the same time, how, taking into account that the national determined contributions presented by states still lead to 2.3 to 2.5 degrees limit, how can we intensify our efforts to have a much more drastic reduction of emissions in the next few years? Now, the COP is confronted with these things, and there are obviously contradictory interests in the COP as there are in the G20. And my hope, the Brazilian presidency has been conducting it very effectively, as the South African presidency has been conducting the G20 work very effectively. I hope that in both cases they will be able to obtain meaningful results. Thank you very much. Sorry? No, I thought it was a generic question, but on the DRC. On the DRC, the question is simple. We must have peace in the DRC. So there are negotiations taking place. There was an agreement in Washington, there was an agreement, partial agreement in Doha, but the fact is that people go on fighting. So I think our priority must be to stop the fighting, to have a complete ceasefire, and simultaneously to make progress in the negotiations of Washington and Doha to have a political solution that allows, as I mentioned in my intervention, for the territorial integrity of the DRC to be respected, but at the same time to address some of the root causes of conflict that exists. And obviously, it is important to say one of the best ways to avoid conflict is through development.
so much, everyone, for being here this